Seated. In 312 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine, before he took over the sole rulership of Rome, he stood before the armies of the other emperor, Maxentius. Now, anxious about the outcome of the battle, Constantine claims to have received a sign from God. And the way that the claim goes is that Constantine saw the sign of a cross made of light in the sky, and he heard these words, "In hoc signo vinces," which translates to English, "In this sign, conquer." Now, whether the account is true or not, the army of Constantine had the luxury of being offered an assurance, if you will, that the will of God was for them to be victorious in their battle. Now, it's noted that many Christians were in the army of Constantine, and so for them to hear from Constantine, "I have seen a vision from your God saying that we're going to win," I'm pretty sure they fought a little bit harder that day. It's always nice to know when God is working. A lot of times that helps us to make decisions a lot easier. I mean, how many of you, when you have questions in life, you want to know what the will of God is, right? What am I supposed to do? We don't know a lot of times. We don't hear God talk to us that way, right? We don't get signs. We don't get visions. And so a lot of times, well, what do? Is God working? Is he here? God doesn't always reveal what he's up to. In fact, if you even look at the history of redemption in the Bible, God does not speak often or frequently. He only spoke to certain people at certain times. Sometimes he would go silent for 430 years. For thousands of years he would go silent. He would just let time go. And then at the right time he would come and he would say something. How do we know that God is working if we don't have a sign? In the book of Esther, we come to grips with a story in which God is silent, and yet he performs one of the greatest acts of redemption for his people in the Old Testament. Mark Dever, the pastor at Capitol Hill Baptist Church in Washington, D.C., he describes the book of Esther as one long narrative illustration of Romans 8:28, which says that we know that God works all things for good for those who love him and have been called according to his purposes. Now, the book of Esther is by far one of the most amazing books in the Old Testament. Some of you all don't believe me, okay? How many of y'all have read the Old Testament? Anybody, any readers of the whole Old Testament here? Anybody? We've got a few. All right, those of you who haven't, you need to start, okay? You need to start. I love the Old Testament because of the stories, right? But Esther especially is so well structured. It's so well put together. The story is so well told that critics of the Bible think that this is nothing more than Jewish fables. It's just myth, it's just fairy tales. This is just a story to explain how it is that they get another one of their little feasts that they celebrate. The most striking feature of the book, really, and why people think it's just Jewish fairy tales, is because God is never mentioned in the book. If you've never read the book of Esther, read it all today and look for the name God, Lord. You will not find it at all. It is not mentioned, period. There's no mention of, we don't see the worship ceremonies. We don't even see a prophet in the book. There is no "thus saith the Lord." And so one of the questions that comes out from this book is, where is God in the book? Now, the wonderful thing about the narratives of the Bible is that these have a way of transcending through time and through culture more than propositional truth can in some ways. I mean, if God wanted to just tell us what he wanted to say in Esther, the book of Esther could have just been chapter 1, verse 1. God will always be faithful to his people. The end. Could have just said it. That's the whole point of the book right there. Could have just said it, but God didn't say it that way. How did he say it? He said it through a story. And now different people, the danger of stories is that they can be easily interpreted through different lenses, and we have to be careful, right? I mean, there's different interpretations of Esther. A feminist interpretation of Esther talks about the rising up of women and how they should break ranks from the men who are trying to control them, right? A misogynist reading of the book of Esther, becomes a story about how women ruin everything, okay? A moralist will read Esther and just want to draw moral conclusions. Well, how do I live from this? What is this book telling me to do? How do I follow God, from Esther? What's he telling me? But a Christian reads Esther in the light of the gospel. And so as we go through Esther, and I am going to tell you the whole story, okay? We have to get the story right. If we miss what the story is, we won't be able to apply Esther to ourselves. So, as we go through it, here are my 3 points, okay? I'm going to take you through the story. Then we're going to see the real storyteller. And then lastly, we're going to see our place in the story, okay? So the story, the storyteller, and then our place in the story. So let's get the story. Let's get the story right. Now, the setting for the story of Esther, it's in the reign of the Persian king Xerxes. Okay, that's his Greek name. In the text here in Esther, he's called Ahasuerus, and I hope I'm not slaughtering his name. Okay, I'm doing the best that I can with that. But his reign was from about 486 to 465 BC. Now, here's an interesting fun fact. If you're a movie buff like I am, okay, if you all saw the movie 300, the King Xerxes from that movie, that's this King Xerxes that is being referenced. Okay, so if that's the picture that you want to paint from Xerxes, you're welcome, all right? But in the movie, Xerxes is portrayed as this rich man. He's always surrounded by gold. He's always surrounded by luxuries. And here in the book of Esther, it's sort of the same thing. We kind of walk into the middle of a party, okay? We're walking into the middle of a feast. Now, I'm going to tell you, with the book of Esther, food drives this story forward, okay? The book begins with a feast, and it ends with a feast. And at every little turning point, there's always food that is involved. So those are your little cues as you're reading the book, okay? Food drives this story forward. I love this book already, right? Now, the first feast is being held by the king. And the author, in chapter 1, he goes through great detail to describe this party. He describes the white cotton curtains, the violet hangings, and the fine cords, or the cords of fine linen, and purple and silver rods, the marble pillars, the couches of gold and silver, the mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, I never thought that was a real color, and precious stones. You see that in chapter 1, verse 6, right? I mean, the cups. This is not a red solo cup party, people. It says that these cups were golden vessels, and the wine was not the cheap stuff, okay? This was not the $2 wine at Walmart. It says that it was royal wine, okay? It's not just any wine, it's the royal wine, okay? No expenses have been spared at this party. And the wine isn't just poured. The story says that it's lavished, okay? This is an open bar kind of party, all right? It's an open bar, but it's also, this is the party for the men, right? It's for the nobles and for the governors, right? And the rule was there is no compulsion, okay? Don't stop drinking, right? Don't let anybody tell you to stop. Just keep going. Just keep going. It's an open bar. Do what you want. And so here, the opening feast, the men are having a good old time. Now, don't miss the detail that this party lasted 180 days. 180 days, okay? I mean, what a Jewish wedding is 7 days. This is 180 days. Good night. I don't know how they can party so much, but 180 days, right? Now, there's another party going on also, Vashti's party. But you might miss it if you don't pay attention, because it is barely given any attention at all. It just says, yeah, the women were throwing their feast also in chapter 1, verse 9. But no description. I mean, she was probably just tea and crumpets or something like that. Right? Her party is not presented as being as lavish as the men. Now, at some point, the king becomes completely intoxicated. He begins boasting about how beautiful his queen is, and he commands that Vashti be brought into this all-guy party so that basically he could show off his trophy wife. Now, back then, one of the rules was the queen is not for public viewing. Okay? Royal women were not for public show. So, in the king commanding Vashti to come over and present herself before all the men, he's basically asked her, to undignify yourself and get over here so we can all see you. And Vashti refuses the king. And boy, what an uproar. I mean, here's Xerxes, right? And again, I kind of picture him from the movie 300. I can't get that image out of my head. But he's the ruler of 127 provinces. All his nobles and all his governors are present. And Xerxes can't rule his own wife. Think about it. The embarrassment, the humiliation that he's just, that Vashti has just committed here. If you pay attention throughout the story, remember, the king is drunk, right? I mean, there's going to be a lot of things that happen to the king around alcohol. The king really, despite how we see him in the movie 300, how he's portrayed, I keep going back to that. I don't know why. That's the dominant image in my head. But Xerxes is actually portrayed as very foolish and easily manipulated under the right circumstances, be it food, be it alcohol, be it women. All these things easily control King Xerxes. He kind of comes off as a fool, really. And so the nobles, they see it, and the wise men, they're like, you know what, you got to handle this, bro. You got to handle this, because if you don't handle it, and here comes the politics of fear, right? If you don't handle it, feminism is going to rise up in your kingdom, and every single wife out there is going to rebel against her husband. Xerxes, you need to make a law, and you need to make a law right now. We need to get this under control. And I mean, he's drunk, right? Yeah, do it. Go ahead. Let's write that law out, right? And so Vashti, she is demoted into the harem, right? And you know, now there's a buzz in the harem, though, right? Like, hey, Vashti's out. Will it be me? Will I be the next one? Will I be the next queen? And so the harem kind of comes to life there. People just, you know, the women in there thinking, maybe this is my way out from this place. I can kind of move up the social ladder. Now enter Mordecai and Esther. These are our protagonists in the story. Mordecai and Esther, they're Jews who have, for whatever reason, they've remained in Persia. Remember, they're exiled out of their land. So some of the Jews have already been able to go back. In fact, the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah are also taking place close to this time period as well. So they're rebuilding Jerusalem, but these two have stayed behind for whatever reason. You know, maybe they didn't get the memo or something, circumstance just didn't work out, but they're not able to go back home. Mordecai has taken the responsibility of raising the young daughter of his deceased uncle. So Esther and Mordecai, they're cousins. They're cousins. Mordecai's the older cousin, raising his young cousin. You know, I mean, what a job, kind of doing, you know, the job of a single parent, basically. And he has to raise her under those circumstances. And Esther, however, she grows up, and she's described as being beautiful in figure and lovely to look at. Beautiful in figure and lovely to look at. And so while this is happening, the king proclaims that he wants his harem filled. Okay? Xerxes is said to have had up to 360 concubines. Not quite Solomon, right? But he had quite a bit. So he issues a proclamation, you know, that maidens be brought to Susa, basically to be pampered for 6 months. And this meant that the officials, they were dispersed throughout the empire, and they were to acquire these young virgins who would become sex slaves of the king. Now, in our modern vernacular, I mean, just call it what it is. Sex trafficking. That's really what it was. She was a victim of sex trafficking. Now, before going in, Mordecai, apparently, it must have been pretty traumatic. You know, the guards coming in, taking her out, and hey, where are y'all taking her? This young lady's going to go to the harem now. She's king's property. And Mordecai's able to follow her, and I guess he's giving her advice along the way is kind of what we see. And one of the things that he tells her, he says, don't tell them that you're a Jew. Keep that hidden. Keep that secret. Don't let that identity come out. And his reasoning seems to be, you know what? Maybe you can gain some advantage by keeping that identity hidden. Assimilate in, go and just do your thing. Listen to whatever they tell you to do. Okay? He's coaching her, right? You know, do these things. Okay? And hopefully that'll keep you alive. I think that's what he has in mind more. But I think he wants the best for her as well. You know, if she can climb up and be queen, you know, maybe she can do some good. So complying with all the advice that she received, and she even got advice from the eunuchs when she went in. Everybody starts telling Esther what to do. Okay? Esther comes off as very compliant in the beginning of the story. She's like this little play doll. Everybody's just moving her around, telling her what to do. Go here, go there, do this, do that. This is what you need to do to please the king. Don't do this, don't break this rule. Bathroom times are 7 a.m., etc., you know, all those sorts of things. Now, life in the harem here, you know, it was great that the women were pampered, but life wasn't what people thought it was either. Okay? Scholars have said this. They said life in the royal harem clearly had its advantages, but also its disadvantages. While women enjoyed every sort of material comfort, and they were indulged and pampered in many ways, they had no recourse for intimate relationship with the husband. They were denied that. Their opportunity to be intimate with the king would have been rare and would offer no companionship. Again, they were just a sex slave. Undoubtedly, they found companions among other women of the harem, or even occasionally with the eunuchs entrusted with the care of them. But that special relationship that's found with a husband raising children within a family setting, those pleasures were denied. It was a pretty lonely life if you didn't make any friends there. So you can probably see why, as Mordecai said, don't tell him you're a Jew. You know, if not, your life is probably going to be very, very lonely in there and very, very depressing. Keep that hidden. Now, every woman saw the king at least once, okay, at the very least, unless you were requested by name. Now, Esther never revealed her ethnic background. As per orders from Mordecai, he would stand at the gate, kind of see if he could get word to her to make sure she was okay. In Esther's 10th month there, since she was taken into the harem, she went to see the king, and the story says that she won the grace and favor in the sight of the king more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And so her queenship is announced with another feast. Okay, so this is that pivotal point in the story. There's another feast. More food is involved in honor of the new queen, Esther. Now, before this act ends, okay, Mordecai happens to be outside the gate, and he's eavesdropping on a conversation, and he hears that there's a couple of eunuchs that want to plot to kill the king. And so overhearing that, Mordecai, basically, I'm going to do the right thing here, gets word to Esther, who gets word to the king, who investigates, and they find out that it's true, and they end up killing the eunuchs. They punish them with death. And so Mordecai saves the king's life that night, too. And so that's the end of Act 1. The deed of Mordecai is recorded in the book of the Chronicles of the king. And thus begins, though, the rise of Haman. Now, you would think that Mordecai should have been rewarded at this point, right? I mean, you just saved the king's life. You're in an honor and shame culture, and Mordecai gets no honor at this time for what he's done. It's just kind of, it's written down in a book, thank you very much. Okay, and that's it. Haman is an Agagite. Okay, that's a decently important detail if you know your Old Testament. The Agagites, or they are descendants of the Amalekites, enemies of the Jews. Okay, if you remember in 1 Samuel 15, Saul has to go and kill King Agag, right? He has to kill him. That's his job, and anyway, we won't get into too much history there. But here's the deal with Haman. So one day, Haman is walking past the gates. Haman has been promoted to a high-ranking general position, or governor, or something of that nature. He's been promoted, and there's been a decree from the king that everybody has to bow to Haman as he's walking by. And so he's walking past the gates, and everybody's bowing. And Mordecai looks at him, and Mordecai doesn't bow. Now, the interesting thing about Haman, though, Haman had to have been quite a character. He had to have been quite a character. Notice that a decree had to be given so that people could bow. That tells us that he was not the kind of guy who earned respect from people. The respect had to be ordered. It had to be ordered because Haman must have just been super wicked. And he wants their respect so much that the king has to say, look, if this is what you really want, I'll make it a law. Everybody has to bow to me. There, are you happy? Haman's happy until what? Mordecai doesn't bow. Tim Keller said, the greatest nightmare of the approval addict is rejection. And the greatest nightmare of the power addict is humiliation. And so here you have Haman, this guy who wants respect, who wants the power. And here's one guy who's going to stand up to him and say, no. And boy, that ticked off Haman. Haman becomes so upset, becomes so furious. He finds out, basically, who are your people, right? And Mordecai, it's kind of funny. So Mordecai's a Jew, but bowing in Persian culture didn't have any religious significance. So, part of the question is, well, why didn't he just bow? It's not like he was bowing to an idol or anything. Nobody would have understood it that way in that culture. And Mordecai, when he comes up to him, he's like, hey, how come you're not bowing? I'm a Jew. And you're kind of thinking, like, Mordecai, you just gave advice to Esther not to reveal your identity, and here you are breaking your own advice. You've just done the one thing that's going to disadvantage you, and now it's going to disadvantage the rest of your people. I'm a Jew. Oh, man. So Haman just kind of walks away. Okay, all right, I'll handle this. Decides to go to the king. And again, so here, another feast, more alcohol involved. And Haman goes and he says, king, there's a certain people scattered abroad, dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so it's not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, all right, here he goes. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasury. So here he is, right? Lobbying for a law. This is the law that I want. I'll pay for the law. I will fund everything for it. Haman has basically come up with a government sanction for an ethnic cleansing throughout the Persian kingdom. It's a prejudicial policy. And the king, Xerxes, again, he comes off as rather easily manipulated here, right? Now he sees money, right? He sees money. He's like, yeah, I mean, why not? Let's do it. Let's roll, And so now Haman uses the power of the state to start a persecution on God's people. The law is created. Haman and the king, they sit down to drink more wine, and it says that the city goes into complete confusion once this law is set out. And Mordecai learns about this, and he's completely distraught. He tears his clothes, and he puts sackcloth and ashes on, and he's crying out bitterly. And maybe he's thinking now, right? Oh, what have I done? All for a little bow. I sold out my people. A little bow. Word gets out to Esther. Mordecai summons him to come in. He's completely distraught. He's not going to go. So she sends, one of the eunuchs. They start passing notes back and forth. And Mordecai reveals to her everything about Haman, how he paid to destroy the Jewish people, sends a copy of the decree to Esther. Mordecai also asks for Esther to go on the king's behalf, right? Hey, can you do something for us? You're up there, we're down here. What can you do for us? Can you help us out? Can you help your people? And as we read, one doesn't simply go into the presence of the king. There's laws in place, for whatever reason. Maybe, to avoid assassination attempts. Those were very common, to avoid coups, right? Just nobody goes to the king. And that's it. Unless he calls you in. That's it. If you pass this line, you're dead. I mean, I went to an air show years ago in Langley, Virginia, and they have the F-22 Raptors there, and those things are sweet. But they will not let you within 50 feet of that Raptor. They have a rope around it, and they have an armed guard, and it clearly says if you cross this line, you're going to get shot. You forfeit your life. That's it. You're dead. Why? The radar system, right? It's not the plane itself. It's the nice radar system that it has, apparently, that helps it stay decently stealthy. I didn't tell you that. You all didn't hear that from me, okay? But that's the law. You cannot go into the presence of the king. You cannot just walk in there and start asking, issues, to change laws, to do this, to do that. That's not the way that it works here. Mordecai kind of has to mess with her, and I'll detail this in a little bit, but he has to kind of argue back and forth with her, right? I mean, I can see these notes going back and forth. I can't help you out. You have to help us out. Well, let me see what I can do, right? And these notes are being passed back and forth from the harem to the gate. But Mordecai persuades her. He's able to persuade her, and Esther resolves to help her people, and she says, I'll go to the king. Though it is against the law, if I perish, I perish. And from this point on in the story, Esther, she's referred to more as Queen Esther. Notice the title change that's put on her. Everywhere in the story, Esther, 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 Esther. And then when she's made Queen Esther, okay, but Esther, Esther, Esther. And then all of a sudden, a change in her title in the story. Now she's referred to as Queen Esther. And what's the author telling us? That Esther has finally decided to step up into her role and to operate in the capacity and in the place where she finds herself in. Esther's not the little compliant Esther anymore. Esther is now take charge Esther. So Esther puts on her royal clothing. She goes to the inner court where the king is, probably standing at the doorway being denied entry at first, but the king looks at her, and out of sheer grace, the king extends the royal scepter. And the king asks her, what is it, Queen Esther? And he's so, the way I picture him, I don't know, I'm beginning to picture a Mexican Xerxes right now, right? Just looking in a sense at his queen wife, like, what do you want, baby? You tell me, up to half the kingdom. Ask. And she says, I want to have a party. I mean, Xerxes is a sucker for parties. He's a sucker for parties. And Esther, I mean, look at her. She knows what she's doing now. I want to have a party. Oh, yeah. I mean, come on now. Guys, talking to the men, right? I mean, if your wife says, I want to have a barbecue and I want fajitas and chicken and sausage, are you going to say no? Probably not, right? You're going to look at her and say, I love this woman. Okay? I mean, that's just the way that this works. And so that's kind of the, what's at play here. That's what Esther's doing with Xerxes. She knows his weakness. I want to have a party, she says, and I want to do the party for you, in honor of you, and in honor of Haman. Haman, right? Oh, yeah. All right. Getting invited to the party here. Okay. And so the king says, I mean, you got it, right? You got it. And so she has the party, the feast, and he's drunk with wine. Again, right? There's a sucker play, right? She knows what she's doing. Let me get him drunk. And then he looks over and he leans and in his drunken stupor, right? Dime lo que tú quieres, chiquita. What do you want? I'll give you anything, baby. Anything. You tell me. And what does Esther say? Let me throw you another party. He loves it. He loves it. Let me throw you another party. I want to throw a party for you and for Haman again. Oh, this is heaven, right? Queen Esther, where have you been these last 30 days, right? Why are you coming up now, right? But the king is suckered. Now, Esther knows what she's doing, and she has Haman leaving the party that night feeling just the way that he wants him to feel. Vulnerable. Up in his place, right? He's being approved of. He's given, everything that he's looking for. He's getting it. He's getting the power. He's getting the respect and the approval. He's feeling puffed up. He thinks he's in the good graces of the king and queen. And as he's on the way home, because he's got to go out the gate, well, there's Mordecai still, right? He sees Mordecai, and he can just walk past Mordecai and go, your day's coming, buddy. Your day's coming. Just you wait and see. Haman gets home, and his wife, asks him, hey, how was work today? And oh, honey, it was great. It was great. The king and queen, they threw a party for me, okay, in my honor. That's 2 nights, or that's, one night, and I've got another party coming up tomorrow. But remember, Haman is driven by the need for approval and by the need for respect and even power. And all these great things have been happening to him in his career, right? He's on top of the world at this point. But he tells his wife, he says, but you know what, honey? This is chapter 5, verse 13. He says, none of this is worth anything to me so long as I still see Mordecai sitting in the king's palace. That's the one thing that's lacking in my career right now. This one guy that will not bow to me, that will not show me the approval, the power, the respect that I think I deserve. When he's gone, then I'll be happy, babe. Then I'll be happy. And so the wife and his friends, they tell him, they're kind of compliant too, right? Go make the gallows. Go get it done. You're in the right spot to do it. You're in the good graces of the king and queen. Why would he deny? And so he has the gallows made. Now that same night, the king could not sleep. But instead of counting sheep, he decides to have the book of the Chronicles of the King brought to him. And I'm like, boring. Come on, who wants to hear a book about government statistics? But I figured probably that's what'll put him to sleep, right? And so he says, yeah, this is what I need to get to bed, right? But the reader starts reading to him, and he hears something. He goes, wait a minute. Mordecai saved my life. Have we done anything for this guy? And so instead of falling asleep, now the king's wide awake, right? And all of a sudden he needs a think tank, right? So he's like, oh, we got to honor this guy. I'm not a king worth my salt in this culture, in an honor and shame culture, if I don't honor the man who saved my life. I need to do something for this guy. I don't want to talk to you. Who's in the court right now? Haman. Bring him up here. I need to shoot some ideas back and forth at him. And so Haman, the irony, right? Haman is down building gallows. He's down there so he can ask the king if he can kill Mordecai. And the king is calling Haman up to figure out how to honor Mordecai. So Haman walks in. Yes, king, what is it? Haman. What is to be done What is to be done to the man in whom the king delights in? Haman, because of all the things that have happened to him, he thinks it's him. He thinks the king is talking about him. And so Haman, and I'm going to do my best Mono Brown impression, does that, fixes himself up and says, well, king, figuring he's about to, tell the king how to honor him, let the royal robes be brought. Let the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Give him the king's clothes, the king's ride, and the king's parade. That's what you should do for this person, O great king. Awesome! Let's do that for Mordecai. Whoa! Haman is just, he's undone himself now, right? He's like, oh no. Oh no. I'm trying to kill this guy, and I just told the king how to honor him. Man, reversals. From this point in the story, Haman goes no place but down. Haman hurries home. He's got to be a train wreck. He's got to be a mess. Okay? He hurries home and he begins to tell his wife everything that just happened. And his wife and the wise men tell him that he has already begun to fall and will surely fall before Mordecai. So the day goes on. I don't know what he's doing, probably just walking around pacing, but he's got to show up to the party. Right? The king and queen, they've summoned him. And after more drinking, there it is again, right? The king says to Esther, what is your request? Now, Esther says this. She says, if I have found favor in your sight, what we want to hear there is, if you really love me, okay, O king, if it please the king, let my life be granted for my wish and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now, the king has essentially professed his undying love for Esther, right? When he says, tell me what you want, I'll give you anything that you want, he's basically saying, I love you. And so after just professing his undying request, he's kind of put in a spot where he can't deny Esther what she's going to be requesting. And so she reveals, there's somebody out to kill me and my people. The king becomes furious. And it's a drunken kind of anger too. If you've ever been around it, it's an interesting kind of anger. Sometimes it almost appears, like a pseudo anger. But the king is furious. He gets up and he's like, I want to know who is it? Where is he? Where's the man who's done this? And Esther, sweet little Esther, a foe and an enemy. This man, Haman. Think about that in the story. This is why God tells stories, right? Think about that in the story. Haman is completely exposed now. He's completely been exposed. He's an emotional train wreck after everything else that's happened. He's undone. At this point, he starts begging or something. But the king walks out. The king needs to get some fresh air. With all the drinking he's been doing, he's like, I need to sober up for this. Steps out, goes to get some fresh air on the balcony or something. And Haman starts begging to Esther, spare my life, spare my life. At this point now, the reverse has happened, right? Instead of the hand of the Jews, or Haman's hand being against the Jews, now the hand of the Jew, in one sense, is over Haman here. And so Haman, as he's walking around, Queen Esther, please. And at some point, there's a couch in the way, apparently, and he trips over the couch. And as he's tripping over the couch, the king just happens to be walking in. And the appearance that it gives, though, is that Haman is trying to assault the queen. It looks like he's trying to jump the queen. And so the king just sees that. The king sees that. And basically Haman is black-bagged and gagged and he's dragged out to be hung on the gallows that he had made to kill Mordecai. And so the author uses irony and a sense of poetic justice even here. Now, the rest of the story is an issuance of the counter decree that the Jews may defend themselves against the former decree. Remember, the law can't be changed, but let's write up another law that will at least help the Jews protect themselves. And that's kind of, a sort of way of negating the other law without having to undo it, because Persians just don't do that sort of thing. But it says in chapter 8, verse 16, it says that the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor because of Esther. Many people even converted to become Jews for fear of the Jews. And when the king's decree went forth, those who sought to destroy the Jews, perhaps even those building the temple in Jerusalem. I mean, remember, Nehemiah's on the wall, right? They're on the wall with swords and spears and shields and everything. Could have been that same decree that people were emboldened to go out and to destroy Jerusalem. In chapter 9, verse 1, it says the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. And thus Esther saved her people from utter annihilation. And so food started the story, and food ends the story. And there's another feast that's established. And that is the end of the story. Now, it's a great story. I'm telling you, if you haven't read it, you need to read it. But I had to tell you the story so that you can get the full effect of the point of the story, which cannot be told in just one chapter or in just a few verses. That's the trouble with some expositional preaching, right? This was given as a whole story. It wasn't given in parts. It wasn't meant to be understood in parts. We were meant to grab the whole. The story of the book of Esther is not really about Esther. It's not even about Mordecai. It's not even about the feast that was created, right? It's not. The point of this book is not to explain a new Jewish feast, okay? The book is actually about God. And now, I can hear it, maybe not from you all because, I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here. But other people who've read the story, they'll say, whoa, wait a minute, stop. Now, God was never even mentioned in that book. What do you mean that this is a story about God? And I just look at him and I'm like, I know, all right? That's actually the literary genius of this story. I mean, what if the story had been told this way, right? Well, it just so happened that Vashti was deposed as queen, and the king just so happened, to be making all these drunken requests. Or it just so happened that Esther, this sweet little Jewish girl, was drop dead gorgeous and got all the right advice from all the right people in order to win the king's favor. Or it just so happened that Mordecai eavesdropped on the right conversation to save the king's life. Or what if the story had been, it just so happened that the king forgot about Mordecai and decided to reward him when Haman wanted to hang him. Oh, it just so happened that Esther suddenly becomes a shrewd person and is able to save her people from utter annihilation. Now, if we were to read this story that way, the story would be completely random. Nothing would hold it together. We would basically walk away saying, I guess she was lucky. And that would be it. That would be the whole point of the story. I hope you get lucky. I hope it just so happens with you too. Now, the author of the book of Esther, when he sat down to write Esther, he didn't, write it and then go, oh no, I forgot to leave God out. He didn't do that. He wrote it this way with the reason so that we can see how God works. That God doesn't always work through miracles. God doesn't always work through big shows or big extravaganza. Sometimes God works through the ordinary. We call this providence. Now, what do we learn from this? We learn that God is always at work for the good of his people, even when it seems like he is not. All right? God is always at work for the good of his people, even when it seems like he is not. Again, right? There's no prophets in the book. Mordecai doesn't say the word of the Lord came to Mordecai, son of, whoever. The book doesn't start that way. Not at all. There's no vision. We don't even have a prophecy, right, that he can look back to. He's like thinking, oh yeah, Jeremiah said this was going to happen. And Daniel in his 70 weeks told me that I'm supposed to go in. He didn't do that. We don't get any hint from the story that he had access to those resources, or that he had access to a prophecy that he could see, how can I work this out? How can I make this happen? God said it would be this way. Mordecai and Esther, they're just ordinary broken people. They're ordinary, they're broken people. They're in a place where they're a minority group. They're deposed, out of their land. They're in exile. There's temptations all around them to basically give in to the Persian culture. They're struggling to keep their own identity in the sense as Jews, and they have to hide it from everybody. But God is in charge. God is in charge. The Westminster Confession, it says this. It says, God, the great creator of all things, doth uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures, actions, and things, from the greatest even to the least, by his most wise and holy providence. And that's what we see here in the book of Esther, is God taking care of his people, even when it seems like he is completely absent or completely silent. And there are circumstances that can make us think that God is nowhere involved in the story. I mean, when you look at the circumstances, right? They're in a pagan place. They're in Susa. They're in the heart of the Persian Empire, right? They're, as Revelation would say, they're where Satan's throne is at, okay? They're in a pagan society. It's completely godless. The men in that society got their identity from their wealth, from their power, as you see in the opening party scene. I mean, that's what that party was. It was everybody, it was the peacocks, showing out their feathers. This is me. This is who I am, okay? The women got their identity through their compliance, through their beauty, and through their sexual prowess. And that's why Vashti's party isn't even elaborated on. It's a man's world. And here's this young girl plunged into the world of men, right? Consider Esther herself. I mean, Esther, she begins as a victim, right? She's a victim under the captors of the Persian Empire. She's placed in the harem to be a sex slave for the king. And, again, you're there and only 4 things can happen, right? The king could sleep with you once and go, meh. You go back to the harem, and that's it. It's basically like living out widowhood. Basically what it would have been like, okay? If you were luckier, I guess we'll put it that way, right? You might become friends with benefits of the king and be on his regular cycle. If you were even luckier, you got to marry the king and produce heirs for him. But if you were the luckiest person there, you got to become the queen. And Esther, I mean, you look at her, she's absolutely compliant. But I mean, think about it. She's a Jewish girl complying with Persian law and with Persian rules, right? Look at her. It almost appears like she's completely capitulated to the culture, right? I mean, by biblical standards, Esther is sleeping with somebody who's not even her husband. She's broken God's law too. She used her body to climb way up the social ladder, and now she's living the high life in the palace while Mordecai is still living outside the gates in the citadel. I mean, when you look at it that way, it's not a pretty picture of Esther here. But Esther is still used by God to bring about his own purposes to save his people through her. God was at work, even if she didn't know it. Now, what does this tell us also? This tells us this. Don't ever think that you are so in charge of your life that you can mess it up beyond a point that God can no longer work through you. Let me say that again. Don't ever think that you are so in charge of your life that you can mess it up beyond a point where God can no longer work through you. Esther's broken. Mordecai's broken. I mean, they're sinners. I mean, they show themselves as weak and foolish, easily controllable. But God was still able and willing to work through them. They didn't know how. They had no word from God. On their end, it involved risk. On their end, that's what it was like. On God's end, God knew exactly what he was doing, even though he kept his way hidden. Now, so what, right? Great story. Where do we fit in? What does Esther have to say to us today? What are some of the similarities that we can connect to? And there's 4. The first one that we can connect to is that we still live in a world that is full of injustices and threats, both to human flourishing and to God's people. I mean, there's a 3rd lawsuit against the cake maker today? We still live in a world like that. We still live in a world that has laws that are created and are used, or loopholes in laws that are used to persecute God's people. We still live in that kind of world. Haman, he was just one manifestation of a greater enemy and of a greater tool. When you read Revelation, Satan uses the power of the state. He uses that to oppress God's people, to persecute them. He used the Roman Empire to hunt down God's people eventually too. He used Egypt before this, right? He used the Babylonians, and now Satan is using the Persian Empire. Eventually Greece will rise up, and Greece will also present a threat to God's people. So the tools of the devil haven't changed. They're still the same. God's people are still vulnerable all over the world to government persecutions. We know this. Just pay attention to the news, right? Christians are killed every day in Africa. There's ethnic cleansing, so, and nobody steps in to stop. Nobody steps in. We still live in that same kind of world. In the story, the threat comes through Haman, and in particular, it comes as a political and a social threat, right? Haman lobbies to create a new law that will systematically oppress and destroy a people. And Mordecai, as a Jew and a minority in that society, does the only thing that he can do. He basically sits in sackcloth, or he puts on sackcloth and he sits in ashes. And the imagery with that is basically, I'm a dead man. I'm as dead as this ashes. I'm burnt up. Okay? Mordecai basically just, the only thing he can do, he cries. He laments. That's what he does. Now, lament is not a category that we're all very familiar with. Theologian Sung-Chan Ra, he's the current expert on the biblical category of lament literature. He defines lament as this. He says, lament is an act of protest as the lamenter is allowed to express indignation and even outrage at the experience of suffering. At the experience of suffering. Another way that we can connect is we still make Esther's excuses. His excuses are still the same when we see people, who are down and out, who are suffering, and there's they need deliverance. Esther, she's not feeling the oppression because what? She's in the palace, right? She's in the palace. She's in a place of relative safety. She's in a place of relative security. She's in a place of comfort. Esther is content by all means. And listen to Esther when Mordecai comes begging, to her to step in and do something, right? She attempts to justify her uninvolvement and the status quo. Listen to her words carefully. She says, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know, that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. Notice what she does. She appeals to the law of the land to keep her safe. Hey, that's just the way it is. My hands are tied. I can't do anything. Everybody knows this, okay? Let's just leave it be, right? There is an exception clause, right? The one whom the king holds out the golden scepter. But as for me, and now she's going to appeal to her circumstances. But as for me, I haven't even seen the king for 30 days. You know what that means? It means he's sleeping with other people right now. Okay? I'm out of the loop. I might be queen, but let's face it, I'm not the one who's got the ear of the king right now. That's somebody else. If I lay low here, if I do good, I can still be queen. Other women can do their thing, but I'm safe here. I'm the queen. Who can touch me, right? Who can touch me? She basically replies back to Mordecai, Mordecai, do you know what you're asking me to do here? Look at where I'm at. You know what you're asking me to do? You're asking me to give all of this up. You know what the law says. Death to the one who approaches. You're asking me to walk into my possible death. Mordecai, you're asking me to suffer. The cost of discipleship here, right? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he said, when God calls a man, he bids him to come and die. And in a sense, that's kind of the call from Mordecai here. Esther, you need to be willing to die to save these people, to save your people. But I'm in a good place right now, Mordecai. I mean, I haven't seen the king in 30 days. I mean, if I just stay quiet, if I live my life in the harem comfortably, things will be good for me. Esther's not that little girl taking orders anymore, is she? Now she's looking out for herself. Now it's Esther's life. This is my life, Mordecai. How dare you ask me to give it up? Look at all that I've got. I'm an orphan Jewish success story. You want me to throw all that away? Can't we just let our people relish in that and that be the end of the story? That we put a queen in the Persian Empire? Esther's figuring out how to look out for her own interests, for her own comforts and her own security. Mordecai is asking Esther, he begs with her to look past her own selfish interests and to serve others where she is. Esther is in a place of privilege. She has a chance to go before the king, a chance that Mordecai and no other Jew has. The Jews, they didn't have a representation there. I mean, there was no, Robert's Rules of Order. right? We didn't have any of that up there. You didn't have representation. Laws could be made with money very easily. We already saw that in the story. Esther, will you do this? Will you identify with your people now? Will you plead for them? Esther, you have to identify with your people so you can mediate for them. And remember, though, Esther has no word from God here, right? They didn't have a Bible. They didn't have the luxury of Bibles. Today, we know. Micah 6:8, it's very easy, right? He has told you, O man, what is good and what does the Lord require, but that you do justice and love kindness and walk humbly with your God. Esther kind of sort of had an excuse that she didn't know, but we don't have the same excuses as Esther. We learn from this that God is calling us to serve him and to serve people wherever we find ourselves. Esther was called to do it in government work. You might be called to do it just at your job, in your home, with your friends, in your hobbies, wherever you find yourself. God is calling us to serve him and to serve people. She's not a priest, right? She's not a professional theologian. She's just an ordinary person who just happens to be queen in the Persian Empire. And what is she going to do with it? The question, again, with our gifts, what are we doing with them? What do we do with them? Are they for me? We've heard Tom say, right? They're for the common good. They're for the good of the church. Every single person here has something that God has given you to use. It could even just be your experience in giving out advice to somebody who needs it. How is God calling us to bring renewal and even deliverance to those who are outside the gate? We face the same temptation. This is another connection. The temptation of the palace. The temptation of the palace. We too, we're afraid to step out because of what it might cost us. We're afraid of losing our reputation. We're afraid of losing comfort. We're afraid of what our political parties might think of us. We're afraid of disrupting the status quo. We reason to ourselves with things like, well, somebody else will come along and do what needs to be done. Or I'm nobody, what difference can I make? We even use theological reasons. Well, it's not our place to get involved. That's the job of the state. If you listen to our excuses that we make sometimes, these are Esther's same excuses, right? The laws are in place to take care of that. Or it's my circumstances. I'd really like to, but I can't right now. If Esther had reasoned that way, and if her reasoning had beaten Mordecai's, nobody would have spoken up for the Jews. In the mid-19th century, the church had a chance to speak up for those slaves who were suffering under the oppression of chattel slavery in the South. But instead of rising up, the church came up with a doctrine that we still carry with us today called the spirituality of the church. The spirituality of the church, in which the church basically said, that's not our job. That's not our job to address that. In a sense, the church at that time had succumbed to the temptation of the palace. That objection, however, doesn't hold up to what we see in Esther. God didn't send Esther to preach the gospel, right? That's not what we see in the story, right? He sent her in his providence to create a law that would counter the systemic oppression that had just been placed in the law of the Medes and Persians. God was going to work through Esther's work. Now, what changed Esther's mind? Because I'm going to argue that what changed Esther's mind is what we need to change our minds as well. So let's listen to Mordecai's argument a little closely, right? Mordecai's reasoning, okay? He says, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape more than the other Jews, for if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So it's a two-pronged argument, right? And he basically says, Esther, okay, you're right. You might lose everything. It's a huge risk to take. But consider, Esther, that you're going to lose everything anyway. Consider that it's already gone. At some point, that law is going to find you. You're going to be hunted down just like every other Jewish person is. And where are you going to go? Where are you going to hide? The law that you let go stands, and you're going to die at the law that you're using to protect yourself right now with. Esther, if you're not willing to use your place to help us, if you're content with living for yourself, Esther, you're already dead. is basically what Mordecai has argued back to Esther. You're already dead. But then he mentions something to her and tells her that all that she has is by God's grace. Mordecai tells Esther that she has been brought into the kingdom of Persia. Okay? She has been brought. Not you came, okay? Esther, you have been brought. The Hebrew verb there, it's passive. Okay? Esther is the one who's been acted upon. She's not the one doing the action. Mordecai is basically telling her, Esther, remember, you were brought here by grace. That beauty that you have that got you the queen spot, you didn't do that. Everybody else did that. God gave you that first. You were pampered into that. Don't think you earned that. You're not owed that security and that comfort that you think you're with right now. It's God's grace that has you there. Again, God is the one who's been at work all along, and without saying it, he's basically saying, Esther, God brought you here. Now what? And he awakens in a sense, now in a sense, after talking about grace first, now that starts to inflame her responsibilities. Now, okay, you know what? That's true. I am here by grace. You know what? I will go. Now I will go. Now I will obey. Now I've seen that God indeed has been gracious to me. Now I'm going to go. And so, after she hears those words, something changes, and she's willing to sacrifice herself and to identify with her people and mediate before them. And so what we learn from this is that grace is what changes people. It's not a law, and it's not the threat of hell, right? Grace is what is needed to change, not the threat of death. We need God's grace. We need to see it. When we look at ourselves, and I'll tell you, I've preached this to myself before I preach it to you. What does it take to change us? I can tell you right now that Esther, as an example, is not going to do it. Okay? Esther, as a mere example, will not do it. Like Mordecai, we need someone who's going to identify with us and mediate for us, but we don't need an example. We need a Savior. We will never leave the luxury of the palace that's alluring us until we see that our own life is also all of grace. The story of Esther, it's really the story of a greater Savior who saved God's people. And it's in Jesus Christ that we see that greater grace. You see, Jesus Christ, he left the ultimate palace to become a man and to identify with fallen humanity so that he could be our mediator between God and man. Jesus Christ, he didn't come, however, at the mere risk of his life. He simply wasn't just willing. Jesus knew he had to do it. Jesus knew that he had to die. He was going to get on that cross, and he was going to give his life. He didn't come saying, well, if I perish, I perish. No, Jesus knew he was going to perish. He knew it. When you read the Gospels, his trip all the way to Jerusalem is one long narrated trip to his own death. That's why they call the Gospels passion narratives. He knew what was coming. He knew why he was born. He knew why he was given so that he could die on that cross. And when we see that grace, to the extent that we see what Jesus has done for us, to that extent are we willing to walk away from the palaces that tempt us. You have to see it. You have to see the cross. If we don't, we're in the palace. We're stuck. The only way out is through Christ, is through what he's done. Until we see what Jesus has done to serve us and believe that he did that for us, we're going to remain in our palaces. And like Mordecai argued with Esther, we're already dead if we're like that. This is the gospel of the kingdom. When you have time today, look over Philippians 2:5-11. None of this is foreign. Okay, and Paul, on the basis of the gospel, he tells the church, the Philippians, guys, don't consider other people, lower than yourselves or you more important. Look at Jesus. Look what he did. What did he do? Well, he humbled himself and he considered other people more important. That's another commentary in the book of Esther. If I can say, throw that in a scholarly article somewhere. But when we see Jesus leaving the palace to serve us, we have to start asking the question, well, who do we need to serve? Once we know we've been served by God, we can stop asking other people to serve us, and we become free to serve. Are we going to embrace our roles as participants in God's story of renewal? In Christ, we have an entire treasury of resources for living up to this bigger, more meaningful, and more beautiful story. We have the Spirit of Christ with us, and so we ask, getting practical, how do we use our power to help those who have nowhere to turn? It can be a simple act, she doesn't know I'm going to do this, but I'm going to put her on the spot. My wife and I, we love to go to HEB together as of late in the summer. And there was an older lady who her groceries, we just saw her groceries on the floor. I didn't even really know what happened, but my wife stops and, she asks if she needs some help. And, the lady had been practically abandoned there by her older son, and, she just kind of, goes off on how ungrateful he is and leaving her there. But it can be something as simple as that. Something as simple as that, seeing people who are down and out and just helping. And there's no excuse when we see that Christ, saw us down and out and came to us. And so the story of Esther is part of a larger story that points to a greater deliverance than Esther provided. The Bible tells us the story of what God has done and is still doing to renew a fallen world. So the story is not over. You do have a place in the story. If you don't believe me, read Revelation 21, and you can see we still have a long way to go. The form of this world is not the palace that Jesus is preparing for us. Only through Jesus is the story told completely, and as Jesus accomplished true and greater deliverance from sin and death. Amen.